Everyone knows the story of Napoleon's unstoppable army. The Grande Armée marching across Europe like an iron tide, crushing kingdoms and rewriting maps. But what if I told you that one of Napoleon's campaigns was halted not by a massive battle, a daring enemy maneuver, or even the brutal Russian winter, but by something far smaller and far stranger? A single broken chain. Yes, a literal iron chain, the kind you might use to lock a gate, played a pivotal role in stopping one of history's most feared military machines. And this isn't some metaphor. It happened. It's in the records. The truth is, this chain was part of a bridge Napoleon desperately needed to cross in order to keep his campaign moving. Without it, his supply lines stalled, his momentum broke, and his enemies had time to regroup. The details of how and why that chain broke will take us deep into a story of geography, engineering, and the razor-thin margins on which empires balance. It begins in the late summer of 1809, during the War of the Fifth Coalition, when Napoleon's forces were advancing through Austria. After a hard-fought victory at Wagram in July, Napoleon was pressing eastward, determined to force Austria into submission. But the Danube River, wide, swift, and treacherous, stood in his way. Crossing the Danube was no small feat. In 1809, there were few permanent bridges across its central stretches, and the ones that existed were heavily defended or destroyed at the first sign of invasion. Napoleon's engineers, famed for their speed and ingenuity, had to rely on pontoon bridges, long, floating structures chained together to span the current. At the Battle of Aspern-Essling earlier that year, these very bridges had been the Grande Armée's undoing. Austrian artillery had smashed them apart, cutting Napoleon's army in two mid-battle and forcing a humiliating retreat. Napoleon had learned his lesson. For this crossing, he ordered the most robust construction possible: iron chains securing the pontoons, reinforced anchor points, and guard detachments protecting every segment. The bridge they built near Pressburg, today's Bratislava, was a masterpiece of military engineering. It could carry infantry, cavalry, and supply wagons in a steady stream. But here's where fate, or perhaps just bad luck, intervened. On the morning of August 14th, as a key corps was set to cross, one of the bridge's main anchor chains snapped. Not frayed, not loosened, snapped clean through. The force of the Danube's current did the rest, ripping several pontoons out of alignment and creating a deadly gap. The entire crossing ground to a halt. Napoleon's officers scrambled to improvise repairs, but the damage had been done. The delay gave the Austrian forces under Archduke Charles the breathing room they desperately needed. And here's the real twist. That chain wasn't weakened by battle damage or sabotage, at least not in the conventional sense. The story of why it failed takes us far from the battlefield into workshops, supply depots, and the murky world of wartime logistics, where a single overlooked detail can reshape the fate of an entire campaign. To understand how a single chain could alter the fate of an army, we have to step back a few weeks before that August morning. After the Battle of Wagram on July 5-6, 1809, Napoleon had forced the Austrians under Archduke Charles to retreat. The Treaty of Schönbrunn was still weeks away, but Napoleon intended to keep the pressure on, advancing deeper into Austrian territory to force quick capitulation and secure strategic crossings over the Danube. This was no leisurely march. Timing was everything. His troops were stretched thin, and supply convoys had to keep pace with the army's rapid movements. The bridge at Pressburg became the keystone in his operational plan. Without it, Napoleon's advance would slow to a crawl. Building such a bridge meant relying on the Grande Armée's corps of engineers, led by General Jean-Baptiste Abel, a man whose reputation for improvisation under fire was legendary. Abel's pontonniers could turn rivers into roads in record time, and for this crossing they pulled every trick in the book. Pontoons lashed with timber beams, iron anchors sunk deep into the riverbed, and most importantly, heavy forged chains linking the entire structure to secure it against the Danube's notorious current. Those chains weren't just any metal. In theory, they were crafted from the best available wrought iron ordered months earlier from workshops in France and the Rhineland. But Napoleon's rapid campaign schedule had forced changes. With the army on the move, replacement chains had to be sourced locally, from foundries in Vienna, Linz, and smaller Austrian towns that had only recently fallen under French control. And here's where a hidden weakness crept in. Wartime production is rarely perfect. Iron from local sources varied in quality, often smelted from ore with impurities that made it more brittle under strain. Officially, every batch was supposed to be tested before use, but in the chaos of a fast-moving campaign, paperwork was skipped. Shortcuts were taken, and some of the chain links delivered to Ebel's engineers bore the subtle signs of rushed work. Uneven hammering, thin weld seams, or hairline cracks invisible to the naked eye. No one noticed at the time, but one of those flawed chains was installed at a critical anchor point on the Pressburg bridge. And even if the metal had been perfect, August on the Danube was a dangerous month for such structures. Heavy rains upriver in Bavaria had swelled the current to nearly double its usual speed, putting immense pressure on the bridge's moorings. Engineers reported unusual creaking noises during the night of August 13th, but they assumed it was normal stress. After all, they had crossed rivers under artillery fire before. Surely the bridge could hold. Meanwhile, Napoleon's staff was already preparing for the next phase. Marshal André Massena's corps was scheduled to cross first, followed by the Imperial Guard. Supply wagons loaded with food, ammunition, and medical stores queued along the bank, ready to roll. Everything depended on that bridge. And somewhere in the middle of it, in a single length of iron link, the weakest point in the entire Grande Armée's plan was waiting to fail. At dawn on August 14, 1809, the operation began. Massena's advance guard stepped onto the bridge, boots thudding against the planks in a steady martial rhythm. The Danube below churned, brown and restless from the rain-swollen current. Ebel's engineers kept watch from both banks, scanning for signs of strain. At first, everything seemed routine. The creaks and groans of timber under load were a normal soundtrack for any river crossing. But by mid-morning, as heavier supply wagons rolled forward, one of the men stationed at the western anchorage noticed something off. The great iron chain, meant to hold the bridge's midsection against the current, had slackened ever so slightly, vibrating in an odd, irregular rhythm. He shouted a warning, but the noise of marching boots, clattering wheels, and shouted orders drowned him out. Then, without warning, a metallic crack split the air, sharp and final, like a musket fired inches from the ear. One of the chain links at the key anchorage point had sheared clean through. In an instant, the tension redistributed across the remaining links, but they were never meant to bear that load alone. The break sent a shudder through the entire bridge, and the central pontoons began to drift with the current. Men shouted in confusion. A wagon carrying powder kegs lurched sideways, nearly toppling into the river. Engineers scrambled to throw spare lines, but the Danube showed no mercy. Within minutes, a section of the bridge twisted out of alignment, creating a dangerous gap that halted all movement. Massena's troops were stranded mid-crossing, half on one bank, half on the other. Napoleon himself, arriving on horseback to inspect progress, was furious. Every hour lost meant Austrian forces had more time to regroup, dig in, and possibly receive reinforcements from Allied contingents further east. Orders flew. Repair crews were to work through the day and night, but replacing a snapped anchor chain was no small task. The spare links were stored miles away, and the damaged section lay partially submerged in the Danube's surging waters. By the time the bridge was patched and declared passable, it was the afternoon of August 15th, a full day and a half lost. In the fluid chess game of Napoleonic warfare, that was an eternity. And while Napoleon's army waited, Archduke Charles used the reprieve to shift troops into stronger defensive positions along the Marchfeld Plain, effectively closing the window for a swift French breakthrough. The press reports at the time made no mention of a broken chain. Official bulletins spoke vaguely of engineering delays and difficult conditions on the river. But in the diaries of Ebel's officers, the truth is plain. A single faulty length of iron, likely hammered in a Vienna forge just weeks earlier, had forced one of history's greatest military machines to pause at the worst possible moment. That day and a half of delay became a ripple that spread far beyond the Danube's banks. When the French finally resumed their advance, Archduke Charles's army was no longer an exposed, retreating force. They were entrenched, their artillery repositioned to command the best fields of fire, their cavalry guarding every likely point of approach. Napoleon still won the subsequent clashes, but they were slower, bloodier, and far less decisive than he had planned. In the aftermath, Austrian diplomats seized on the stalemate to push for terms that preserved far more of their territory than a crushing defeat would have allowed. The broken chain didn't just slow a bridge, it slowed the momentum of an entire campaign. Military historians often debate turning points, and here the irony is stark. All the brilliance of Napoleon's strategy, all the discipline of his troops, all the resources of his empire were momentarily at the mercy of a single piece of forged metal. If that link had held for just 48 more hours, the Austrians might have been swept from the Marchfeld before reinforcements arrived, possibly ending the war in one swift stroke. Instead, the campaign dragged on, draining men and resources Napoleon would soon need elsewhere, most critically, in the looming conflict with Russia. In a sense, this was the butterfly effect in its purest form, a craftsman's unnoticed flaw in a Vienna workshop shaping the grand currents of European history. It's a reminder that empires can hinge on the smallest components, that even the mightiest plans can be undone by an overlooked detail. And it challenges us to think, what in our own lives, our own work, is the chain link that everything depends on? Because history teaches us this. Sometimes the fate of nations isn't decided in palaces or battlefields, but in the quiet failure of a single ordinary thing. If you enjoyed uncovering the hidden mechanics behind one of Napoleon's most overlooked setbacks, make sure to like this video, share it with someone who loves history's what-ifs, and subscribe to the Domino Effect. Here, we peel back the layers of famous events to reveal the tiny, often invisible causes that changed the world, and might just change how you see it.